the breach of the oath of office, which facilitates the opposition to the Constitution, which then facilitates the opposition of its context in expanding definitions, and thus the action of the expression of becoming an adversary of the rights of the people, which then materializes the function of its complete contempt of the base responsibility as a breach of office by the disillusionment of its prerequisites, requiring the acknowledgement of a usurpation for the purpose of insurrection and the use of the equipment stolen by the double agents to be leveraged against that function as a function of insurrection is a violent overthrow of the authority. And to the extent that they have done so, have triggered the fuller context of superior law signed by Congress, explaining and expanding on the function and subordination to the Constitution, such as with the Declaration of Independence, expressing the retaliation remedy or the pursuit of the remedy in order to actively combat the threats derived by those who would subordinate superior law into inferior law, and thus the act of subordinating inferior law underneath normal military conduct, and the military being designed to be leveraged against foreign adversaries is not legal to be used against civilians, which an act of treason would facilitate as a direct act or declaration of war against the civilian population is an act of treason. And to this extent, the function of them being leveraged for the purposes culminating through KKK contracts to conduct hate crimes, which would then facilitate the permanent extortion and manipulation, which would make a permanent state of voter fraud, would permanently disconnect the capability by hybrid warfare from that military to engage in the function of traumatizing the government itself, and thus the action of committing treason. And to the extent that that would materialize into its fullest culmination, would transform the country into an entirely different country, and thus actively require the study of the military code of conduct as the function of the manipulation of information to this extent would also by definition manipulate the military codes, which would be leveraged as the new superior law. And to the extent that that happens, it would turn its disapproval into approval and its approvals into rejections. And to the extent that it becomes that, it facilitates the full rejection of logic and order in favor of the arbitrary, unchallengeable, secret courts of the King of England, which the United States had separated from, to conduct all of its abuses in perpetuity. And to the extent that that manifests itself, they, as an enemy combatant to the United States government, are required by the American people's duties and rights to manifest the full opposition to crush that insurrection, to make everything that Lindsey Graham had said in his declarations to justify hate crimes through the government equipment to become manifest confessions to being an enemy of war to these United States, requiring every soldier loyal to the Constitution to engage in full military retaliation against for the crushing of its insurrection. The complete contempt for the oath of office and its subordination to the Constitution is a disconnection in its entirety of the authority of the office derived by that Constitution, and to the extent that they, having done so, might bring it so far as to commit that insurrection, to seek to normalize customs of force against that constitution in the definition of insurrection has conducted a self-enforcing act of insurrection, materializes the self-enforcing action of disqualification on the basis of that insurrection. And the moment that they have done so, as criminal intent as an accessory before the fact, they have conspired to that action, have dissolved their authority to hold a position inside the United States government, and are no longer to be considered an officer of the United States, a senator of the United States, a congressman of the United States, a judge of the United States. They are no longer a part of the government. By definition, they have disconnected as a double agent from all functions of service of law which would qualify their right to hold office or have any of its amenities, benefits, or equipment. And every action that they take while in that state has become a criminal action, which, being a theft against, such as, but is not limited to, the war on David, which is the assumption that those series of usurpations are the justification behind the war on David, which, having believed from the military intelligence estimate of David's legend companies in order to cut out the roots of the American system, would commit that conspiracy to actively prevent and sabotage all functional rights for the activity and enforcement of a hate crime as a status quo function of these double agents, which, acting covertly, pretend a secret which they would actively defend by the culminating compounding illusions. And to the extent that this would happen, the secret record, acknowledging that fact, understands that the non opposition would derive the growing of the roots of that family and support structure and network. And to the extent that that would happen, would facilitate the great expansion of economic means to create money. And as the law has been asserted, money is speech. To the extent that money is speech, the removing of the opportunity is censorship for the criminal changing of status without due process, which is to say, without lawful authority or service of law, and thus the action of it being disqualified from any function of the government as an unofficial act, materializing the function of it being wholly disconnected as an individual without a legal government, and thus a full enactment of the definition of a hate crime, even from the distorted, creepy, out of context delusion which has been crafted by the Confederates, who, by definition, have been committing edits to those systems in order to engage in the functional changing of the legitimate definitions into a neutralized, neutered version, which is wholly inadequate to the function to be able to prevent it from fully challenging them in their objective, that they might, by subtleties, scam the United States into non-existence. And to this extent that censorship of money has been enacted, the functional acknowledgement of the aristocracy choosing the Senate is then subverted, as the belief of the capabilities and the confidence of the money that they have been able to derive creates the confidence of the general market, which then materializes their capability of projection of potential profits in the future, which they would have sold to the original, which at the version that they had acknowledged that would have compelled their capacity to purchase the right to do the action instead from the party, and thus the action of David Boles receiving the sales of the right to do those contracts instead of him under the good faith estimates materializes the function of the starting wealth, which materializes David Boles as the aristocracy at birth from those systems, which then materializes the function of his control over the Senate directly and the Congress in general indirectly from the function of his money for speech. And to the extent that this materializes, the Confederates, having survived off of voter fraud, materialized their opposition to this function, lest the United States form republics, which, by definition, they assumed that David Boles would have started his own political party, which would have first taken over California, requiring their retaliation by preemptively opposing the political party, similar to their opposition to Trump, but extraordinarily worse and under far more complications. To the extent that the United States has suffered these injuries, David has been targeted by those subversions that he might, as a prisoner of war, become missing in action, delaying and obstructing all of those contracts, preventing the contract schedule from materializing into this function, and to the effect that those activities would have been obstructed, then the rights to conduct those functions would be obstructed or delayed. To the extent that Congress is still American, would be forced into the position of the dual as is defined in the Declaration of Independence, as it is a clarification and expansion to the Constitution's definition, making it superior law signed by Congress, which is not something that Congress is able to legally oppose, as it has confirmed it in its seal by that signature. And to the extent that the authority of Congress is vested into the Declaration of Independence, it is superior law. It, in that action, materializes the function of the dual, which acknowledges these abuses, which then facilitates the capacity of the restoration of that contract schedule, which includes the function of the immediate obligation of payment for the right for somebody else to do those things instead. And thus, the action of the receiver under the court order would then materialize the purchase of the right to do that contract, and to the extent that they have done so, facilitate the immediate sale and ingestion of the extraordinary profits derived by that to David under the original prices without the obstruction, and to the end that that had materialized, facilitate our full conversation to the liquid resources capable of providing the necessary investigation and funding of the service by David Boles as the intelligence oversight to conduct the investigations certified by Congress as his lawful right under the obstructed value that is owed to him by law to engage in the function of the investigation, compiling the reports for the sober educated answer of Congress in its declaration of war against all enemies, foreign and domestic, including United States military personnel who, having sworn to defend the United States from all threats, foreign and domestic, in subordination and definition by the Constitution as superior law, materializes the function of their statement if they are in fact still Americans. And in the action that they are not Americans, then they are to be, in this self enacting function, removed as an enemy combatant, and not to be respected under an office which they, having acquired by fraud, do not have authority to continue to act in. Alternatively, the American version, which having been obstructed, would then, by definition, no longer have these obstructions in place, which would compel them to give their legal answer. And whatever the policies are on Congress registering a formal declaration of war, which is the remedy to David Boles, would then provide that declaration of war under that legal process to David, giving him the authority to use the military to enact that war against those enemies of the United States Constitution, including but not limited to the potential to the use of martial law if the enemies of the Constitution be found in these United States, and the obligation of the United States to engage in this function as though with the material purpose of the restoration, as though there had not been an injury, which is the obligation by law, shall have a government to enforce the service of that law, and thus the action of the materialization of these changes requires the full investigation of the secrets which, being fully disclosed, materializes the function of the complete validation of these United States against its enemies, foreign and domestic, preventing the use of KKK activities as hybrid warfare to undermine, subvert, and collapse the United States government, fully disconnecting the equipment derived by its existence and civilian oversight, and thus the action of preventing the civilians from forming a republic by which to serve its constitution, and thus define themselves as an enemy of war to these United States, which, having had a declaration of war committed against it, has a choice to defend the United States, which they've sworn to do, or to not defend the United States, outing themselves as an insurrectionist double agent designed to compromise national security as a double agent, as a traitor to these United States. And afterwards, that they, having thrown off the bands of the adversaries to the Constitution, might form a new government administration, and under its processes, which have been refined, be conducted accurately, completely, in full good faith for the entire exercising of those elections, facilitating the new blood rushing in, surging the extraordinary powers of the American people. And to those that have been defrauded by any means or every means or all of the genius, you need to materialize the function of understanding that the use of those anarchists for their subversion and ignoring of law materializes the function of full anarchy as terrorism as a form of government. And to the extent that that happens, that every advantage that they might have provided, such as the prostitution for those policies of anarchy, in the materialization and supremacy of white supremacy, facilitates every retaliation under the female Gnostics, who, as witches, would have conducted every form of witchcraft, magic, and illusion, and for those extents materializes the full function of the toxic femininity as a form of government, and having been subordinated to them, materializes the functions of their arbitrary insurrections, which then facilitates the full collapse of the system into Jubilex, the demon lord of ooze, as everyone, being defrauded, becomes equally pathetic. Everyone becomes a mindless ooze. And to the extent that this becomes true, it is the expression of throwing acid into their face. And the action of having done so facilitates the normalization of the abuses by strength as its own law. And to the extent that strength becomes its own law, that the male would dominate and abuse the female, as domestic abuse becomes law, as challenging it would be the sense of morality of God, which they've acquired liberty. And to the ends that this has happened, it justifies the normalization of the abuses, such as in India, Pakistan, or many of the others who have accepted these types of locations and activities have turned themselves into the approval of the abuses, which has led to those who have more strength to use acid to throw in women's faces, having rejected them, become disfigured as a retaliation, which is normal life and normal society, according to these mentalities, which have culminated into the entirety of their culture, having normalized these actions to not retaliate against them, forming it into a viable way of dealing with the issues as the abuses culminate and build and accelerate and compound on each other. Then you have the full realization of anarchy in its tasty, delectful death. And sin that has found maturity becomes its own punishment. And at that express point, you understand in its entirety that you have rejected God in every form in order to support these policies' context.